Part 4 of Chapter 16, APUSH Notes. Continue on with Garrison. What would the kind of position someone like Garrison, this radical, lunatic, quote-unquote, fringe abolitionist, evoke from the South? And no doubt about it, a very defensive position. So let's look at the Southern reaction to the abolitionist movement. First, anti-slavery movements dried up in the South. Seeing the radical movements of the North, that was it. No more toleration of such a position in the South. Major crackdown on dissent in the South. Owners were legally prohibited from freeing slaves. Legally prohibited. Southern Post Office refused to deliver abolitionist literature. Charleston mob breaks into post office and destroys anti-slavery material. You have in Congress the silencing of abolitionist voice with the gag rule passed in 1836. All petitions relating to slavery from the citizens were automatically tabled without discussion. That means just put aside and not discussing. So you weren't even allowed to discuss the issue in Congress, except nobody's going to mess with old Nestor. Former President John Quincy Adams is now a representative in Congress for Massachusetts, and he's the leading abolitionist in Congress. Remember, his daddy and his mom were anti-slavery, and he certainly is too. And he's got that little extra something others don't have in Congress. He's a former president. So they can't kick him out. They can't shut him up so much. And he's going to take advantage of it. He feels the moral rightness of the issue. So historian Garrity says, the gag rule accomplished what can only be called a political miracle and made a popular hero out of John Quincy Adams. The historian Morrison says, old Nestor lifted up his voice like a trumpet, till all slave-holding, slave-trading, and slave-breeding absolutely quaked and howled under his dissecting knife. Wise of Virginia, Rayner of North Carolina, Johnson of Maryland, and scores more of slaveholders, striving constantly to stop him by starting questions of order and by every now and then screaming at the top of their voices, that is false, objection, objection, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker. But he just would not be silenced. I demand, Mr. Speaker, that you shut the mouth of that old harlequin. At least half the slaveholders left their seats and gathered in the corner of the hall where Mr. Adams stood. Whenever any one of them broke out upon him, Mr. Adams would say, I see where the shoe pinches, Mr. Speaker, and I will pinch more yet. If before I get through every slave trader, slave breeder on this floor does not get materials for bitter reflection, it shall be no fault of mine. Nevertheless, it's not repealed until 1844. Wow, I mean, it's almost blows your mind, ridiculous, messing with the First Amendment on the House floor. This is how emotional the issue is getting. They just want to put it in a corner and forget about it. So let's look at movement towards an apologist view of slavery. Slavery came to be defended no longer as that peculiar, it started off as that necessary evil, then went to that peculiar institution, but now literally saying it's a positive good. John C. Calhoun, 1837. Oh, John C., you sure did change from a nationalist, didn't you? I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two different races of different origin, and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together. The relation now existing in the slaveholding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good. And here were the arguments for the defense of slavery. Yeah, this is a pretty tough solve. So let's take a look. First, you have the scriptural defense. It's allowed in the Bible. And blah, 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 blah. So these were some of the typical arguments used by the South. Historical defense. You can click on this link and see Aristotle's defense of slavery. Heck, Socrates was a slave. In every organized society, men of superior talents become masters over inferior talents. Oh, it must be just Darwinian. And hey, that's what they did in the past, and that's great civilizations based on slavery. Okay, the third defense. Perceived black inferiority. You get these ridiculous science, like the science today, or you study the bumps on the head. Well, they have that there. And you can read the quote for yourself. I'm not reading that aloud. And the fourth defense, the benefits of the slave system. Benefits of the slave system, they're more content than wage slaves. And listen to them sing out in the fields. I mean, working in the factory is so much worse than being a slave. They're well-fed, well-housed, well-clothed, well-cared for in old age and in childhood. Now, I will give you this. In old age, they were taken care of. The rest, well-fed. Kids under 10 were given one set of clothes for the entire year. Well-housed. Are you kidding me? Just one thing to say about this wage slave thing. I think I can count on no hands how many wage slaves ran away to the South to become a slave. Quote, a merrier being does not exist on the face of the globe than the Negro slave of the United States. Again, a Southern quote. And the next defense of slavery, the potential of Christian conversion. Hey, in Africa, they didn't know of Jesus. They were definitely going to go to hell. They're so lucky we enslaved them. Now they can go to heaven. So the results of the Southern overreaction, it transformed the issue of slavery into a broader philosophical issue. Quote, Southerners played into the abolitionists' hands, not only by stifling criticism where they had the power, but demanding its suppression in places where they had no power. Thousands of Northerners who were indifferent to slavery valued freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and of petition. Thus, Northerners felt that their natural rights were threatened by the South's stand on the issue of slavery. So those who didn't care now all of a sudden care. Big idea here. Big idea here. You get my hint. It further emotionalized the situation. The abolitionist movement grew from 150,000 in 1840 to 250,000 a decade later. Results. At no time were there a majority of Northern abolitionists. The issue became transformed into an emotional one with far broader implications than merely the slavery issue. Freedom of the press, freedom of speech. Thus, abolitionism and the Southern reaction to it made compromise more difficult. And this is what we've been keying in on, if you haven't noticed. The Southern reaction to it. Was compromise possible, or was the Civil War an irrepressible conflict? I think we'll talk later of a quote by Emerson where he tries to get a group to pitch in for manumission, to buy slaves out of slavery. And no one pitched in. The emotionalism was there. Compromise looked farther and farther from possibility. And this is the end of chapter 16 notes.